Στη Wind ξεκινάμε μια νέα εποχή. Αναπτύσσουμε το δικό μας 5G δίκτυο σε κάθε γωνιά της Ελλάδας. Ένα δίκτυο νέας γενιάς με ασύλληπτες ταχύτητες έως 1 Gbps. Ένα δίκτυο που προσφέρει απεριόριστες δυνατότητες. Για μια νέα, ψηφιακά εξυγχρονισμένη κοινωνία για όλους. Wind 5G ήρθε.
Everything and nothing has changed. Even if the world feels uncertain, it's reassuring to know things that were important before still matter today. Connecting people, sharing ideas, and solving problems. These things will always be in our DNA. Working across borders, helping to keep doors open, business flowing, and continuing to realise the hopes and ambitions of our customers and colleagues. When you think about it like that, thankfully, not quite everything has changed.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this very special Economist event to mark the bicentenary of the Greek Revolution of 1821. My name is Joan Hoey, and I'm the Director for Europe at the Economist Intelligence Unit in London. It is a great honour for me to chair this event, together with my Greek co-chairs, John Papageorgiou and Michaelis Mitsos, who will moderate sessions this afternoon. We are all Greeks. These were the words of the English Romantic poet Shelley, written soon after the start of the Greek Revolution of 1821. This expression of solidarity with the Greek cause was echoed by other Philhellenes and supporters of the Greek cause, believe that they had a stake in the conflict. Greek independence became an international cause célèbre thanks to Shelley, and even more so another English Romantic poet, Lord Byron. As the historian Roderick Beaton explained, those who went to fight on the Greek side believed that Europe owed a debt of civilization to the Greeks. Shelley continued, "Our laws, our literature, our religion, our arts have their root in Greece." But the supporters of the Greek Revolution were concerned not only with extolling the glories of the past, they were invoking the past to confer legitimacy on the contemporary struggle for independent nationhood and freedom from foreign rule. For them, the Ottomans stood in the way of a new Europe of independent nation states built on classical foundations. The Greek revolutionaries fought bravely and with great determination against the odds, but they could not win on their own. The internationalization of the Greek independence struggle led to the intervention of foreign powers, Britain, France, Russia, which ultimately made victory possible. The battle that decided the fate of the Greek Revolution was fought in the Navarino Bay on October the 20th, 1827. The British, French, and Russian task force all but destroyed the combined Ottoman and Egyptian fleet. And from that point onward, the outcome of the revolution was bound up with great power politics. The Protocol of London, signed on February the 3rd, 1830, on behalf of the governments of Britain, France, and Russia, the Greeks were not consulted, declared that Greece would form an independent state and enjoy all the rights attached to independence. Foreign powers were to dominate Greek politics for long after Greece achieved independence in 1830. The role of foreign powers at various crucial moments in the subsequent history of Greece, in the Second World War and the Civil War, in the Cold War, and of course during the Greek sovereign debt crisis, will no doubt feature prominently in our discussions today. Greece was not only a pioneer in achieving independence, it also became an electoral democracy very early. Universal adult male suffrage was achieved in 1864. Some have argued that this was a fundamental flaw in Greece's development. Greece became a democracy before it had developed a modern state. The combination of a weak state dominated by foreign powers and the early establishment of the franchise led to the emergence of a system of clientelism that has never been eliminated. This is likely to be another focus of our discussions today. It would be wrong to focus only on the problems and challenges, however, and not on the enduring qualities and achievements of the Greeks. And I do not mean the ancient Greeks, but the modern Greeks from 1821 to 2021. The inspiration that I take from the struggles of the modern Greeks over the course of 2 centuries is twofold. I am inspired by the indomitable spirit of freedom and the desire for independence from foreign tutelage, which the Greeks have demonstrated on countless occasions in the campaign for independence, in the struggle against fascism during the Second World War, in the resistance to the rule of the generals, and in the refusal to accept meekly the intolerable austerity of the bailout era. The British historian E.H. Carr said that good historians have the future in their bones. Besides the question why, the historian also asks the question whither, where next? Today we will be asking those 2 questions as we survey the past and discuss contemporary developments, always discussing with an eye to the future. I'm looking forward very much to our discussions today to commemorate this landmark anniversary. We have a stellar lineup of speakers across 7 sessions. I encourage you to follow as many sessions as possible and to submit questions to our speakers via the online platform. We will start with the official inauguration and a recorded message from Her Excellency, the President of the Hellenic Republic, Katerina Sakelloropoulou.
Κυρίες και κύριοι, το συνέδριό σας επιχειρεί έναν απολογισμό 2 αιώνων οικονομικού βίου της σύγχρονης Ελλάδας. Μια μακρά και περιπετειώδης πορεία, με πλήθος αντιξοότητες, στη διάρκεια της οποίας η χώρα μας έζησε ιστορικές επιτυχίες, βίωσε όμως και καταστροφές. Ο πόλεμος της Ανεξαρτησίας, τα 200 χρόνια του οποίου γιορτάζουμε, ήταν η πρώτη εθνική επανάσταση που κατόρθωσε να επικρατήσει στην Ευρώπη το 19ο αιώνα. Ακολούθησαν κι άλλες, σε μια σταδιακή διαδικασία διάλυσης των πολυεθνικών αυτοκρατοριών και δημιουργίας εθνικών κρατών, που ολοκληρώθηκε τον 20ο αιώνα. Από τα πρώτα του βήματα προς την ελευθερία, το έθνος των Ελλήνων δεν είχε να αντιπαλέψει μόνο τη στρατιωτική υπεροπλία μιας αντίπαλης Οθωμανικής αυτοκρατορίας, αλλά την ανυπαρξία πόρων, την οικονομική ανέχεια, την αρχική απουσία στήριξης. Μοναχή το δρόμο επήρες, εξανάλθες μοναχή. Δεν είναι εύκολες οι θύρες, εάν οι χρήατες κουρταλεί. Γράφει ο εθνικός μας ποιητής στον ύμνον στην ελευθερία. Μόνοι τους ξεκίνησαν τον γενναίο και ρυψοκίνδυνο αγώνα τους οι Έλληνες το 1821. Αλλά σύντομα, με μια επιτυχή επιστράτευση πειθούς και διπλωματίας, κατόρθωσαν να πείσουν τις μεγάλες δυνάμεις της εποχής για το δίκαιο του αγώνα τους και για τη χρησιμότητα ενός ανεξάρτητου ελληνικού κράτους. Η επέμβασή του στον Αβαρίνο το 1827 έγειρε την τελική πλάστιγγα υπέρ των επαναστατημένων Ελλήνων. Το κόστος των πολεμικών δαπανών, σε συνδυασμό με τους αδύναμους κρατικούς και κοινοβουλευτικούς θεσμούς, καθώς και την ασθενή φορολογική βάση του 19ου αιώνα, οδήγησαν συχνά την Ελλάδα στον ξένο δανεισμό. Ξεκινώντας από τα δάνεια της Επανάστασης, το 1824-25, που αποτελούσαν βέβαια επίσης μια πρώτη ψήφο εμπιστοσύνης των τραπεζιτών του Λονδίνου για το μέλλον του ελληνικού κράτους. Και μερικά χρόνια αργότερα, το δάνειο των δυνάμεων, το 1833. Η υποστήριξη των ξένων δυνάμεων κατά τον 19ο αιώνα αναπόφευκτα συνοδευόταν από ένα πλέγμα εξάρτησης και κηδαιμονίας, που δεν απέτρεψε πάντως τις χρεοκοπίες και αναδιαρθρώσεις χρέους μέχρι το τέλος του 19ου αιώνα. Τα πρώτα 100 χρόνια ελεύθερου ελληνικού κράτους χαρακτηρίστηκαν από το εγχείρημα της εθνικής ολοκλήρωσης, με την απελευθέρωση εδαφών από την Οθωμανική Αυτοκρατορία. Στις αρχές του 20ου αιώνα, εκατοντάδες χιλιάδες Έλληνες έφευγαν μετανάστες για την Αμερική, σπρωγμένοι από την ανέχεια και τις οικονομικές κρίσεις. Μετά τη μικρασιατική καταστροφή του 1922, η Ελλάδα κλήθηκε να ενσωματώσει πάνω από 1 εκατομμύριο πρόσφυγες. Ήταν ο μεσοπόλεμος των ραγδαίων κοινωνικών και πολιτικών μεταβολών στην Ελλάδα, όπως και στην υπόλοιπη Ευρώπη. Η χώρα μας βγήκε από το Δεύτερο Παγκόσμιο Πόλεμο με ένα βαρύ φόρο αίματος και καθημαγμένη την οικονομία, έχοντας αντισταθεί στεναρά στις δυνάμεις του άξονα, ακόμη μια φορά από τη σωστή πλευρά της ιστορίας. Εισήλθε στη μεταπολεμική περίοδο με το τραύμα του εμφυλίου, αλλά με έναν αμετακίνητο γεωπολιτικό προσανατολισμό προς τη Δύση. Στις μεταπολεμικές δεκαετίες, η ελληνική οικονομία διήλθε μια περίοδο ταχείας ανάπτυξης και εκβιομηχάνησης. Στη δεκαετία του 70, η Ελλάδα ήταν πλέον από αναπτυσσόμενη οικονομία μια χώρα μεσαίου εισοδήματος. Κυρίες και κύριοι, από το 1974 η Ελλάδα ζει τη μακρότερη περίοδο όριμου και εμπεδωμένου δημοκρατικού βίου. Στην εποχή της παγκοσμιοποίησης, η χώρα μας μετέχει στο πλέγμα της διεθνούς οικονομικής αλληλεξάρτησης ως το ένατο παλαιότερο μέλος της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης. Η ένταξη της Ελλάδας στην τότε Ευρωπαϊκή Οικονομική Κοινότητα πριν από 40 χρόνια ολοκλήρωσε την πορεία ανεξαρτησίας της Ελλάδας που ξεκίνησε πριν από 200 χρόνια. Η χώρα μας είναι πλέον ένα ισχυρό κράτος δικαίου, με θεσμικές εγγυήσεις και αποτελεσματική προστασία των ατομικών και κοινωνικών μας δικαιωμάτων. Με τη στενή συνεργασία των εταίρων της, η Ελλάδα μετέχει και ανταποκρίνεται στις κοινές προκλήσεις της Ευρώπης. Την αποτελεσματική αντιμετώπιση της πανδημίας, τη θωράκιση των υγειονομικών δομών και της κοινωνικής συνοχής, την προστασία της απασχόλησης και την άμβλυνση των οικονομικών επιπτώσεων της κρίσης, την ενίσχυση των παραγωγικών δομών της χώρας, τη διοχέτευση επενδύσεων στην ψηφιακή αναβάθμιση, την ενεργειακή μετάβαση της χώρας στις απαιτήσεις της πράσινης και βιώσιμης ανάπτυξης, τις προσφυγικές και μεταναστευτικές ροές. Στον μακρό ιστορικό χρόνο, η Ελλάδα των τελευταίων 200 ετών αποτελεί συνολικά μια ιστορία προόδου και επιτυχίας. Αυτό δεν σημαίνει βέβαια ότι δεν υπήρξαν και λάθη. Στην τελευταία κρίση χρέους της δεκαετίας του 2010, η Ελλάδα πλήρωσε ένα βαρύτατο τίμημα για τα λάθη του παρελθόντος. Ωστόσο, οι δημοκρατικοί θεσμοί άντεξαν και η κοινωνία επανεπιβεβαίωσε τη δέσμευσή της στο ευρωπαϊκό εγχείρημα και στο κοινό ευρωπαϊκό νόμισμα. Η κρίση συνέβαλε στη συλλογική μας αυτογνωσία και τη δημοσιονομική μας υπευθυνότητα. Η Ευρώπη βγήκε και αυτή σοφότερη από τη δοκιμασία της τελευταίας δεκαετίας. Απέναντι στην αβεβαιότητα του καιρού μας, η ευρωπαϊκή ενότητα και αλληλεγγύη αποτελεί τη μεγαλύτερη ασφάλεια. Εύχομαι καλή επιτυχία στις εργασίες του συνεδρίου σας.
I would like to welcome now Christos Diakouras, Minister of Finance of Greece, to give a keynote address on the subject of this event, Greece, 200 years of economic survival. Welcome, Minister.
Thank you, Joanne. Thank you for inviting me one more time to a prestigious virtual event of The Economist in order to discuss, as you mentioned, about challenges, developments, and achievements in these 200 years of economic survival with an eye to the future. Κυρίες και κύριοι, φέτος εορτάζουμε τα 200 χρόνια από την έναρξη της Ελληνικής Επανάστασης. Επανάσταση που συνιστά αναμφίβολα τομή στην ιστορία του ελληνισμού, καθώς αποτέλεσε την ιδρυτική πράξη του νεότερου ελληνικού κράτους. Παράλληλα όμως συγκίνησε, ενέπνευσε και αφύπνισε λαούς σε όλη την οικουμένη, συνιστώντας παράδειγμα για μετέπειτα αγώνες για την προάσπιση της ελευθερίας, της ανεξαρτησίας και της δημοκρατίας. Η φετινή χρονιά, με το ιστορικό και συμβολικό βάρος που φέρει, μπορεί και πρέπει να αναδειχθεί σε κυμήλιο εθνικής αυτογνωσίας και ταυτόχρονα να αποτελέσει πολύτιμη ευκαιρία απολογισμού, αναστοχασμού και οραματισμού. Πόσο μάλλον που η φετινή επέτειος συμπίπτει με προκλήσεις της γείτονος, την αυξημένη αβεβαιότητα και μια νέα, ιδιότυπη μάχη που δίνουμε για να αποτινάξουμε το ζυγό της πανδημίας και να επανακτήσουμε την ελευθερία μας. Κυρίες και κύριοι, είναι αλήθεια ότι στην πορεία αυτών των 200 ετών συγκροτήσαμε τη Νέα Ελλάδα. Προοδεύσαμε, περνώντας μέσα από συμπληγάδες. Πολεμήσαμε τόσο γενναία, που ακόμα και όταν χάσαμε πολέμους, αναγνωριστήκαμε ως νικητές. Όμως, υποπέσαμε και σε λάθη, σε καταστροφικές εμφύλιες διαμάχες. Διαγράψαμε τροχιά με πολλά πάνω, αλλά και αρκετά κάτω. Όμως, χάρη στην αυταπάρνηση και στις θυσίες του ελληνικού λαού, αλλά μερικές φορές και στην αλληλεγγύη εταίρων και συμμάχων μας, καταφέρναμε να σταθούμε όρθιοι, βγαίνοντας δυνατότεροι μετά από κάθε κρίση. Η Ελλάδα αποτελεί παράδειγμα χώρας που επιτυγχάνει, μέσω διαδοχικών κύκλων δημιουργίας και καταστροφής, να προχωρά προς το μεγάλο στόχο της, που είναι η μετεξέλιξή της σε μια σύγχρονη, σε μια ευημερούσα δημοκρατία. Ειδικότερα όσον αφορά στην πορεία της ελληνικής οικονομίας, αυτή χαρακτηρίζεται από περιόδους με εντυπωσιακά αναπτυξιακά άλματα, αλλά και με στασιμότητες και υφέσεις. Ιχνηλατώντας από την ανεξαρτησία μέχρι σήμερα, διαπιστώνουμε ότι κάλυψε μεγάλο μέρος του χάσματος που στην αφετηρία την χώριζε από τις περισσότερες χώρες της Ευρώπης. Και τούτο, παρότι αρκετές φορές φλέρταρε με την οικονομική καταστροφή, ως συνέπεια ενδογενών λαθών και εξωγενών παραγόντων. Όμως, παρά τις δοκιμασίες και τις κρίσεις σε αυτά τα 200 χρόνια, η χώρα κατάφερε όχι μόνο να επιβιώσει οικονομικά, αλλά να προοδεύσει και να εξελιχθεί. Είναι αλήθεια ότι η πορεία της οικονομίας, εκτός από λάθη, περιέχει πολλά και σημαντικά επιτεύγματα. Ενδεικτικά σημειώνω την εγκατάσταση των προσφύγων στην Ελλάδα, οι οποίοι συνέβαλαν στην αλλαγή κουλτούρας, στον πόλιασμα ιδεών, στη μεγέθυνση της οικονομίας. Το μέγιστο επίτευγμα της εισόδου της Ελλάδος στην Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση και ακολούθως τον σκληρό πυρήνα της, την Ευρωζώνη. Τις εντυπωσιακές φάσεις ανάπτυξης και εξυγχρονισμού κατά τις περιόδους Χαρίλαου Τρικούπη, Ελευθέρου Βενιζέλου και Κωνσταντίνου Καραμανλή, που μετέτρεψαν την Ελλάδα από οικονομία και κοινωνία υστέρησης σε μια ανεπτυγμένη χώρα του ευρωπαϊκού χώρου και του κόσμου. Την θεαματική βελτίωση του μορφωτικού και βιωτικού επίπεδου των πολιτών της. την ανάδειξη σε χώρα που κατάφερε να καταστεί και παραμένει επί δεκαετίες το πλουσιότερο κράτος στην ευρύτερη γεωγραφική περιοχή. Συνεπώς, το ισοζύγιο των 200 ετών είναι ξεκάθαρα θετικό για την πατρίδα μας και όλους τους Έλληνες. Κυρίες και κύριοι, ο απολογισμός των 200 ετών από την εθνογερσία προσφέρει μια ξεχωριστή ευκαιρία να αναλογιστούμε αυτά τα επιτεύγματα, αλλά και τα λάθη μας. Στα λάθη πρέπει να σταθούμε όχι ως απλοί παρατηρητές, αλλά ως συνειδητοποιημένοι πολίτες, που τα ανιχνεύουν και τα αναλύουν, με ακρίβεια και ειλικρίνεια, ώστε να μην τα επαναλάβουμε. Η εμπειρία και τα διδάγματα του παρελθόντος προσδιορίζουν σε μεγάλο βαθμό τους γενικούς άξονες των προτεραιοτήτων, τους οποίους οφείλουμε να υιοθετήσουμε. Συγκεκριμένα, πρώτος άξονας, η οικοδόμηση ενός νέου παραγωγικού προτύπου. Εάν διατρέξουμε τη σύγχρονη ιστορία μας, θα διαπιστώσουμε ότι ένα από τα μεγαλύτερα μειονεκτήματα της ελληνικής οικονομίας υπήρξε η έλλειψη επαρκούς τεκμηριωμένου σχεδίου. Οι οικονομικές κρίσεις που διήλθε η χώρα μας στο πέρας των 2 τελευταίων αιώνων ανέδειξαν με εμφατικό τρόπο τις αδυναμίες του εκάστοτε εφαρμοζόμενου παραγωγικού μοντέλου, που για μακρές περιόδους δεν στηρίχθηκε στους ισχυρούς πυλώνες της παραγωγικότητας και της ανταγωνιστικότητας, ενώ παρουσίαζε ροπή προς την κατανάλωση, τον υπέρμετρο δανεισμό και την έλλειψη υγιών ξένων επενδύσεων. Γι' αυτό, βασικός στόχος της σημερινής κυβέρνησης, από την αρχή της θητείας της, είναι η στροφή της ελληνικής οικονομίας σε ένα νέο, σύγχρονο, εξωστρεφές, ανταγωνιστικό, ανθεκτικό, πράσινο, ψηφιακό και κοινωνικά δίκαιο αναπτυξιακό μοντέλο, με αύξηση της συνολικής παραγωγής, των εξαγωγών και των επενδύσεων, κυρίως μέσω της αξιοποίησης των σύγχρονων τεχνολογιών, της διάδοσης και εφαρμογής της γνώσης, της προώθησης σε σύγχρονες κατευθύνσεις, της εκπαίδευσης, της κατάρτισης, της διαβίου μάθησης, της έρευνας και της καινοτομίας. Έχουμε ύψιστο εθνικό χρέος να αξιοποιήσουμε στον μέγιστο δυνατό βαθμό το σύνολο του ανθρωπίνου δυναμικού της χώρας και ιδίως των νέων, προκειμένου να αναδείξουμε τις τεράστιες δυνατότητές της και να αναβαθμίσουμε την πέραν των συνόρων ακτινοβολία της Ελλάδος. Δεύτερος άξονας, η εφαρμογή ισορροπημένης δημοσιονομικής πολιτικής. Η άσκηση συνετής και ισορροπημένης δημοσιονομικής πολιτικής καθίσταται ζωτικής σημασίας για την υγιή ανάπτυξη της χώρας, χωρίς να αυξάνεται υπέρμετρα το χρέος εις βάρος των επόμενων γενεών. Η σημερινή κυβέρνηση ακολουθεί αυτή την οικονομική στρατηγική από την πρώτη στιγμή. Ακόμα και κατά τις περιόδους και την περίοδο τη συγκεκριμένη της υγειονομικής κρίσης, όπου κρίθηκε αναγκαία η αλλαγή σχεδιασμού και η εφαρμογή επεκτατικών πολιτικών, ως Υπουργείο Οικονομικών προχωρήσαμε μεν στην αξιοποίηση της υφιστάμενης σε πανευρωπαϊκό επίπεδο δημοσιονομικής ευελιξίας, αποφεύγοντας όμως τον δημοσιονομικό εκτροχιασμό. Τρίτος άξονας, η περαιτέρω αναβάθμιση της ποιότητας των θεσμών. Ο θεσμικός εξυγχρονισμός του ελληνικού κράτους αποτέλεσε μια αργή διαδικασία που δεν στερήθηκε πισωγυρισμάτων. Η γραφειοκρατία, η πολυνομία, οι πελατειακές σχέσεις και η πλημελώς λειτουργούσα διοικητική μηχανή στάθηκαν στο τροχοπέδι για την οικονομική ανάπτυξη και την προσέλκυση επενδύσεων επί πολλές δεκαετίες. Ωστόσο, ήδη από τα πρώτα χρόνια ύπαρξης του νέου κράτους και παρά τις όποιες θεσμικές αριθμίες, είχαν φανεί τα πρώτα ψήγματα φιλελευθερισμού και δικαιοσύνης. Αντίστοιχη είναι και η πρόοδος αναφορικά με την λειτουργία της αντιπροσωπευτικής μας δημοκρατίας ως διαδικασία εγγύησης ελευθερίας μέσα από την απόλαυση των δικαιωμάτων κάθε μορφής. Αναντήρητα, η Ελλάδα, ειδικά μετά το 1974, έχει πραγματοποιήσει άλματα στον συγκεκριμένο τομέα, χωρίς αυτό βέβαια να σημαίνει πως δεν υπάρχουν ακόμα πεδία και τομείς που υπολείπεται. Άλματα έχουν συντελεστεί και κατά τη θητεία της σημερινής κυβέρνησης, στους τομείς της βελτίωσης της λειτουργίας των θεσμών, της αποδοτικότητας της δημόσιας διοίκησης και της αντιμετώπισης της φοροδιαφυγής και της φοροαποφυγής, αξιοποιώντας και τις δυνατότητες των νέων τεχνολογιών. Τέταρτος άξονας, η διαμόρφωση περιβάλλοντος ενότητας. Ένα από τα μεγαλύτερα διδάγματα της ιστορικής μας διαδρομής είναι ότι έχουμε ανάγκη την σύμπνοια, την συνένεση και τη συνεργασία, καθώς ενωμένο το έθνος μας άνθησε, εντυπωσίασε και μεγαλούργησε. Αντιθέτως, οι διχόνοιες και η επικράτηση του λαϊκισμού ως γνώμονα λήψης σημαντικών αποφάσεων αποδείχθηκαν μοιραία λάθη που οδήγησαν σε εθνικό διχασμό και οικονομική κατάρρευση. Δίχως την τοξικότητα και την εκκοφαντική ένταση αυτών και δίχως την κατά καιρούς επικράτηση των σιρήνων της δημαγωγίας, η Ελλάδα θα είχε σίγουρα επιτύχει ακόμα σπουδαιότερα επιτεύγματα. Μιας μακράς πνοής μεταρρύθμισης της παιδείας μας, η οποία θα βασίζεται στις θεμελιώδεις αρχές και αξίες του πολιτισμού μας και στους βασικούς άξονες της εθνικής μας ταυτότητας, θα ενισχύσει το αίσθημα εθνικής ενότητας. Πέμπτος άξονας, ο δυναμισμός και το αίσθημα εθνικής αυτοπεποίθησης. Η Ελλάδα οφείλει να διαδραματίσει πρωταγωνιστικό ρόλο στο εγχείρημα της ολοκλήρωσης του ευρωπαϊκού οικοδομήματος και στη διαμόρφωση της νέας εποχής, παγκοσμίως, που ανοίγεται μπροστά μας. Με περηφάνεια και αυτοπεποίθηση διατυπώνουμε συνεκτικές προτάσεις για την επίτευξη ευρωπαϊκής αλληλεγγύης, ευημερίας και ισότητας. Βαδίζουμε στο μέλλον με δυναμισμό και εμπιστοσύνη στον εαυτό μας. Επιπλέον έχουμε αποδείξει ότι η χώρα μας αποτελεί δύναμη σταθερότητας στην ευρύτερη ταραχώδη περιοχή, έναν πυλώνα δημοκρατίας, μια χώρα με ισχυρό momentum και καταρτισμένο ανθρώπινο δυναμικό. Το αποδείξαμε και πρόσφατα, συνεισφέροντας επικοδομητικά στον ευρωπαϊκό διάλογο για τα μέσα αντιμετώπισης υγειονομικής κρίσης και των οικονομικών επιπτώσεών της. Η κυβέρνηση της Νέας Δημοκρατίας έχει ισχυροποιήσει τη φωνή της Ελλάδος στους ευρωπαϊκούς θεσμούς. Οραματίζεται, προτείνει και υλοποιεί. Η Ελλάδα δεν έχει μόνο ένδοξο παρελθόν, αλλά και ένα πολλά υποσχόμενο μέλλον. Κυρίες και κύριοι, συνοψίζω. Στο πέρασμα των 200 αυτών ετών, οικοδομήσαμε με πρωτεργάτη τον Ιωάννη Καποδίστρια ένα σύγχρονο, δημοκρατικό κράτος, μέλος της ευρωπαϊκής και παγκόσμιας κοινότητας και κατακτήσαμε υψηλό επίπεδο ευημερίας. Η πρόοδος αυτή συντελέστηκε μέσα από σκληρή δουλειά και συνεχείς αγώνες, περιόδους αλματώδους ανάπτυξης, αλλά και διαστήματα όπου αποκλίναμε για κάποιον καιρό από την πορεία μας. Ζήσαμε στιγμές θριάμβου, αλλά και καταστροφής. Πράξαμε σωστά, κάναμε όμως και λάθη. Προχωρήσαμε μπροστά, κάναμε όμως βήματα και προς τα πίσω. Το βέβαιο είναι ότι δεν σταματήσαμε ποτέ να αγωνιζόμαστε. Όπως και σήμερα, που δίνουμε αυτή την πρωτοφανή μάχη με την πανδημία. Μάχη από την οποία θα βγούμε πιο δυνατοί, ενωμένοι και αποφασισμένοι να αξιοποιήσουμε τα διδάγματα του παρελθόντος και να δράξουμε τις ευκαιρίες του μέλλοντος. Είναι στο χέρι όλων μας να υπερνικήσουμε τις δυσκολίες και να συνδιαμορφώσουμε ένα μέλλον υψηλής, βιώσιμης, έξυπνης και κοινωνικά δίκαιης ανάπτυξης. Γιατί όταν υπερισχύει η ενότητα και η ομοψυχία, όταν είμαστε εις το εμείς και όχι εις το εγώ, όπως τόνισε ο στρατηγός Μακρυγιάννης, οι Έλληνες καταφέρνουν με θαύματα, ακόμα και υπό αντίξωες συνθήκες. Κυρίες και κύριοι, η Ελλάδα που έρχεται από μακριά, έχουμε χρέος όλοι μας να την πάμε μακριά, με εθνική αξιοπρέπεια, συνολική ισχύ και ευημερία των πολιτών της. Σας ευχαριστώ πολύ και πάλι για την πρόσκληση.
Thank you very much, Minister Staikouras, for those reflections on the past and that very positive focus also on the future. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us. We're now going to have a 3-minute break before our first panel discussion of the day, when we are joined by 3 eminent historians of Greece. So a 3-minute break, and we'll start with our next panel. Thank you.
Perfection is found in the simplest of things, in the love shared by a young family enjoying their day, in healthy organic foods free of impurities, and even in a single drop of water. But over the years, water has become imperfect. Farming, mass production, and fertilizers have polluted our drinking water with toxic nitrates. There isn't a single source of spring water on Earth that can actually say it's completely pure, except one. In Romania, along the Carpathian Mountains, is the largest untouched forest in Europe. 60,000 square miles of wild forest safeguard the original purity of massive rainfall. It's a place where thick, fragrant pines, firs and spruces stand majestically over a verdant undergrowth, guarding against the influence of man. A protected region still populated by countless deers and the largest European population of brown bears, lynxes and wolves. Here, deep in the wilderness, is the source for the purest, most perfect water in the world, Aqua Carpatica. A water that has taken a 40-year underground journey through layers of Neogen volcanic rock and dolomite, which filters the water of impurities and enriches it with natural bicarbonates of calcium, magnesium and potassium. Thanks to the existence of extinct underground volcanoes, naturally occurring carbon dioxide dissolves through faults into the aquifer, and the water becomes naturally sparkling. A water that poses a smooth and pleasant taste, perfectly balanced and naturally nitrate-free. Experience water love. Aqua Carpatica, the water that loves you back. Visit us today and learn more. aquacarpatica.co.uk.
Welcome to our first panel discussion of the day, 200 years of contemporary Greece, the aim of which is to look back at 200 years of modern Greece and also to consider what the future holds for Greece. We have 3 distinguished historians of Greece who will share their insights and discuss the momentous events of the past 200 years. I would like to introduce all of them in turn. Yanni Kotsonis, Professor of History and Russian and Slavic Studies at New York University. Stathis Kalivas, Gladstone Professor of Government, the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Oxford. And Kevin Featherstone, Eleftherios Venizelos Professor in Contemporary Greek Studies, Professor in European Politics in the European Institute at the London School of Economics. Welcome, all of you. Good morning.
Good morning, thank you.
I'm delighted to have you all. Good morning. So what we're going to do is we're going to take each of you in turn. I believe you have about 4 or 5 minutes, which is very challenging, to talk about the past 200 years and your reflections on the struggle for Greek independence and development since then. So let's not waste time. We'll have about 20 minutes for discussion afterwards. I'll turn to you first, Yanni Kotsonis, to kick off the discussion.
Thank you, Joan, and thank you for the invitation. Again, I'll be brief, and I'll focus on two concepts that relate to the Greek Revolution and War of Independence. One of them is the idea of the nation and how it's evolved into the present, and the other one is the idea of independence and how that's evolved in its tortured way into the present. And in terms of the nation, and because after all, the Greek Revolution produced the Greek nation state, and it was the first of Europe, meaning a state which is identified with its own people. And it was kind of a surprise at the time, and we should understand that it came a very violent process by which a territory which was Ottoman and multi-confessional, full of different religions, was reduced to only one religion. And that religion would be Orthodox Christianity with some allowances for Catholics. This was an extremely violent process. It came about partly under the influence of Europeans who thought that Greece and Europe had to be Christian. And what we see of the 80s and the revolution is an overhaul of the nature of local demographics so that we're left with only one population, as understood by the revolutionaries and understood by the European powers. We see the disappearance of Islam completely. And it's part of this narrative of the nation, which still exists today in certain narratives, which is the nation is inherently violent. And of course it is. Any revolution will be violent. And this one was particularly left behind in devastation. We still speak about the nation and its dangers, that it's total, that it's complete, that it doesn't allow for outsiders in some cases, and this is true, and it's a conversation we still have. But there's another part of the debate which we've been hearing less of, which is it that the nation held people in the past 200 years. And the nation, in something different, beginning with the Greek nation and continuing all across the Balkans and ultimately globally, it contributed a sense that that people are no longer just subjects and inhabitants, citizens, right? At the very least, they have entitlements and they can make demands. The Greek Revolution endowed the local population, those who survived, that is, with a sense that they too can demand a better life. And the improvement, which is remarkable over the past 200 years, which we see in this region and in Greece, owes largely to this concept of citizenship, of the individual being protected individually and as property, and being able to invest it and to operate freely within certain shared norms. So these are the two sides of the idea of the nation, both of which I think are true. But the other one is independence. Independence is also a mixed bag. So the Greek War of Independence resulted in the creation of the Greek state, more or less by 1830. And this state was said to be sovereign and independent. Now, sovereignty also meant that you take on sovereign debt. And so part of the history of the past 200 years has been the fight for independence, but the acquisition of sovereign debt, which has burdened the country for the past 200 years. We know that even in the course of the revolution, the first loans came about, coming from Britain. Those Greece became responsible for in the succeeding decades. The new state was given very large loans by the three protecting powers. This was a burden on the country. It involved the occupation of certain ports in order to seize revenues. This was in the 1850s and in the 1890s. And of course, if you want the obvious example, it would be 2010, 2012, up until the present day, and the sort of, the burden that presented and the transformations that have been imposed on the country. So if you look at it this way, independence means there's an independent country being smacked around and pressured by outside powers. And of course, this is true. That is the case to some extent. But we often neglect to recognize that outside powers become factors in domestic politics. Even the most severe austerity measures, when they're imposed, often have local supporters as well who see it as an opportunity to introduce one or another reform, for better or for worse. Which is to say, the lenders of the 1830s and 1840s were each intervening with their own parties in Greek politics. Fast forward to the present and the Troika and the imposition of austerity measures on the country. There were a lot of people at the time, which we didn't hear about, but they're legion, who believed that things had gone too far with conspicuous consumption and personal debt and also national debt. And this was a time to be able to introduce what they considered to be more rational, and which was to say a balanced budget, and with it cutbacks, cutbacks which would fall in one or another place according to one's politics. So it's not entirely, and it has never been entirely, a matter of an outside country or a group of countries imposing their will on this country. It's also how those countries become part of domestic politics and allow players domestically to practice their politics to pursue their goals. And as we saw for the previous speaker, a very good representation of that point of view, which is that the idea of discipline and balanced budgets ultimately is a good thing for the country, as opposed to others who believe that this is basically a form of national torture. This is also the legacy of the past 200 years. And Joan, I'm going to leave it at that.
Let's turn to Stratis Kalidas.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, good morning.
Hi. I'll take it precisely from there. I think Yanis made some very good points, and I'd like to take us back to the summer of 2015, which is, as you remember, was the high point of the recent Greek crisis. And back then, many economists, a lot of famous economists, including Nobel Prize winners, thought that Grexit was inevitable, and actually some of them even predicted potentially the end of the euro. But as we know, things turned out differently. And I want to take that as my starting point to go back to the history, the economic history of Greece, and to see why were those predictions wrong. I'm going to answer that sometimes economists ignore politics, and the politics of debt are perhaps as important as the economics of debt. There is a very interesting puzzle at the center of Greece's economic life, and this is that even though its economic trajectory appears to be one of uninterrupted financial disasters, existing metrics today show that Greece has done pretty well from where it started, even though it hasn't really completely closed the gap between itself and the most advanced European economies. It is fairly close to them. It belongs to the same group. So how can we reconcile these two different parts of the story? Financial disasters on the one hand, fairly economic achievements, fairly good economic achievements on the other. So there's a very nice paper by Reinhardt and Trebesh that outlines the standard economic story of Greece. It's a paper of going back to 2015, and it goes roughly like this, quoting from the paper. First, the history of Greece is a narrative of debt, default, and external dependence. Second, it's characterized by recurring and persistent cycles of external indebtedness and default. And third, debt and default are perennial themes of Greek history. The conclusion is that there is a 200 years body of evidence to support the view that chronic reliance on external capital has repeatedly led Greece to ruin. So I'd like us to keep in mind those two terms, ruin, and the second term, that the most costly legacy of external debt has been the loss of political control, the theme brought also by Yanis. Keep those two things in mind, and let me make three very quick observations. The first one is that Greece perennially has suffered from a lack of domestic capital. There was access to capital could be acquired through foreign direct investments or external borrowing, and we know the difficulties of generating the former. Now, external borrowing, as we all know, has many risks, but it is a solution to domestic capital scarcity. And so assessing it requires us to analyze the trade-offs that it entails rather than accept it or reject it on the basis of some outcomes. And so the question is, was the trade-off of external borrowing historically worthy for Greece or not? My second observation is that Greece traditionally has been run by ambitious and modernizing elites, very often with a cosmopolitan outlook, that often have strained to generate domestic political support for their ambitious reformist agendas. As a result, sacrificing a measure of national sovereignty in exchange for externally imposed economic discipline was not always perceived by those elites as a pure cost. It was also a means of implementing an otherwise impossible to implement reformist agenda. That's my second observation. So, and my third brief observation is that goes back to the famous J. Paul Getty adage that if you owe the bank $100, that's your problem. If you owe the bank $100 million, that's the bank's problem. And I think it applies perfectly well to Greece, because throughout history, effectively what Greece has done is to use external borrowing as a way to acquire the kind of external leverage that could not be obtained otherwise, not just for fiscal discipline, but also to achieve geopolitical advantage. And this is, I think, no better illustrated by the story that Yannis referred to of the loans that Greeks received during their War of Independence. And I'm going to quote from an unlikely source. This is Yuval Noah Harari's book, Sapiens. He has a very small passage about Greece. It's precisely about the question of loans. And I'm quoting from his book. He writes that in 1821, the Greeks rebelled against the Ottoman Empire. The uprising aroused great sympathy in liberal and romantic circles in Britain, but London financiers saw an opportunity as well. So they proposed to the rebel leaders the issue of tradable Greek rebellion bonds on the London Stock Exchange, and the Greeks would promise to repay the bonds plus interest if and when they won their independence. Private investors bought bonds to make a profit, or out of sympathy for the Greek cause, or both. The value of Greek rebellion bonds rose and fell on the London Stock Exchange in tempo with military successes and failures on the battlefields of Greece. The Turks gradually gained the upper hand. With the rebel defeat imminent, the bondholders faced the prospect of losing their trousers, and as a result, their interest was the national interest of Greece, so the British organized an international fleet that in 1827 sank the main Ottoman flotilla in the Battle of Navarino. After centuries of subjugation, Greece was finally free. Now, Harari notes, of course, that freedom came with a huge debt that the new country could not possibly hope to repay. But I think we should take a pause here and note the flip side. Without external support, Greece would not have gained its independence. So external debt in this particular case, and I would argue in future cases as well, shows us that it didn't cause ruin, but regeneration. So losing a measure of political control, my key point is in the case of the economic history of Greece, should not be equated to the terrible economic outcome of economic ruin. And sometimes it could be seen effectively as a trade-off that's acceptable, and perhaps even as an effective political strategy for the country, a country that is and was at its origins extremely poor, devoid of natural resources, devoid of human capital, devoid of access to capital. And I think introducing this more measured image, this balance between politics and economics, allow us in a sense to challenge the standard economic story about Greece, which predicted, wrongly as we now know, Brexit in 2015, and see how things can work in a different direction as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That is excellent. Thank you all for keeping to time as well. So over to you now, Kevin Featherstone. Welcome.
Thank you, Joan, and thank you for the invitation and for a very interesting panel. Let me take up a brief historical point. I think from 1820 onwards, we have what I'm going to call a Navarino complex in Greek history that continues to the recent period. The Navarino complex, I'm going to say, is where great powers stumble almost by accident into Greece's affairs and then set its fate. The Battle of Navarino was a matter of avoiding a peripheral state being a nuisance in a bigger international game, destabilizing larger strategic interests. In parallel, however, Greece domestically was then left to struggle to catch up with its more advanced allies. This catch-up process has been one of some angst for Greece, as it has sought a modernity defined elsewhere. This year has seen not only Greece's bicentenary, but also the 40th anniversary of Greece joining the then European community. But well before 1981, Europe was the key reference point in a self-torture between Greece's self-image and its domestic reality. We may look back to ancient and classical times and acknowledge that Greece gave to Europe much of its meaning. Of course it did. But today, Greece defines Europe's incompleteness in the form of the systemic limitations of the European Union. In the first 2 decades of Greece's EC membership, Europe was the focus for a light touch modernization process. The funding flowed into Greece with the integrated Mediterranean programs and the cohesion funds, etc. European money constituted most of Greece's infrastructure developments. Crudely, it was a matter of putting new wine in all bottles. The Eurozone crisis, of course, saw Europe shift to hard constraints, the conditionality with a troika and a severe austerity. For Greece today, the challenges remain. Can it live with a deepening integration process? Can it reform domestically without the European Union offering carrots and sticks? For when we look back 200 years, we can discern in the original conditions of the new Greek state the antecedents of Greece's ongoing peripherality, its divergence, and its weakness. Today, we might ask, who wants reform in Greece? In response, we'd note that the domestic constituency for reforms, defined by an economic liberalism, is relatively small. And we'd say that such a reform agenda is relatively alien to the Greek tradition. We might also add that clientelism and Roussetti politics mitigate the scope for reform by increasing the political cost. In each respect, we can detect similar domestic conditions in Greece in the 19th century. The early development of the modern Greek state resonates with the constraints on reform in Athens today. Greece has lacked the capacity to fully catch up, and rather like at Navarino in recent times, the European Union has primarily wanted to isolate the Greek problem. Yes, reform in Greece shot up during the years of the bailouts, but the bailout conditions were often misconceived, making the recession greater and missing the opportunity for wider, meaningful reform. It's still not clear that the EU can manage a heterogeneous economy in which Greece is a key outlier. Yet Europe is crucial to the politics of reform in Greece. Is the new European Recovery and Resilience Fund a game changer? Is Greece more committed to catch up now after its recent trauma? On both counts, I suggest the answer is no more than a tentative perhaps. The answer is a tentative because just as 200 years ago, Greece's future is tied to a great power, but we don't know if the great power will intervene domestically to help and whether Greece has any greater capacity to catch up. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. So some really interesting and provocative points made then in these 3 opening remarks. So, and I would like, if possible, well, I'm going to encourage people who are following this discussion to send in their questions. I would also encourage all of you to respond to points that the others have made. I think that would be nice to have that to and fro between the 3 of you. So let's just pick up on then some of the kind of key points that have been made, and obviously you've covered some of the same ground. So I guess the first question then, which is a rather obvious one on the role of foreign powers historically. To what extent was Greece's independence and sovereignty always circumscribed? It seems to me that Greece, more than many other states, is an outlier in this respect. What would be your answer to that? You've touched on this, obviously, the impact on Greek domestic politics, the divisions in Greece historically on this question, but is that the key theme, do you think?
Are you asking me?
This idea of... Yes, let's start with you, if you'd like to respond to that.
Okay. I mean, it's, by the 19th century, we've entered the modern age of finance and international finance. So there's not a country which is completely independent of market forces and of bond markets. So to say that Greece is dependent on bond markets, it's true, but it's a truism, and it's true of any country whatsoever. The United States, Britain, France, I mean, who doesn't depend on bonds? The question is what kind of leverage you can exercise within those markets, and that goes back to something that Stathis was mentioning, which is that Greece might not be able to hit back with force and to set the rules, but it can work within those rules and maneuver in order to exercise a certain kind of leverage, which is to say, yes, we're going to agree to this package, but on these terms, negotiated and so on and so forth. Because it's a smaller country, the effect of a change in the bond market is outsized compared with a larger country. On the other hand, Greece is something of the norm because there are many countries invaded since the 19th century which are tiny, even smaller than Greece. Imagine how it feels to be Portugal, for example. Imagine how it feels even now to be Argentina, which is another case. Compromise sovereignty, yes, but this is true of any modern country.
Well, just to take that further, and you can respond to this. Is that something that's been there since 1821, or would you say that it's changed? I mean, has the idea of the nation state is certainly taken a battering in recent times? To what degree has that changed more recently? I mean, you talked about, Professor Koutsonis, about the two dimensions of the idea of the nation, and the second one was about the idea of the citizen and agency, and actually the citizen having agency, and actually people having a belief in the possibility of change, which was a much more positive kind of dimension of that idea at that time. I would say that's no longer the case, and so it's not just the idea of the nation and its affairs at the level of the state, but also at the level of the citizen. That idea of the citizen actually having an active role and some agency and the possibility of bringing about change has also taken a very big battering as well in recent times. But let me, Stathis and Kevin, come back, but you're welcome to come back on that idea afterwards as well. So who would like to come in now? Stathis?
Well, if I may follow up on Yannis's point, I would say that certainly the decision of Greece to participate in the European integration project is another way in which Greece has decided to, in a sense, sacrifice part of its sovereignty in order to participate in a much bigger entity. We shouldn't also forget the fact that along the financial dimension, there is a geopolitical dimension. Greece's location is in a rather dangerous place in the world, in which the Balkans meet with North Africa, Western Europe, and Asia. And Greece has had to manage various security challenges along the way, which are very challenging given Greece's size and objective military profile. It's very interesting if we go back to history to see that Greece managed to be on the winning side of the two world wars, and Greece alone among its Balkan neighbors managed to avoid the fate of being part of the Soviet bloc during the Cold War. And these are outcomes that are associated with a specific foreign policy and a very close alignment with the West, which otherwise would, without which the fate of Greece would have been very different today. So we need to take stock of that. We need to take stock of how Greece's alignment with the West entails certain compromises, but at the same time allows the country to benefit from the support of European powers vis-a-vis especially situations in the Eastern Mediterranean that have been very challenging otherwise. So if we put together the entire package, financial and geopolitical, security and economic, I would argue that the balance is fairly positive overall throughout these 200 years. And very often it's a matter of seeing the glass half empty or half full, but I would say the compromises were worth the outcomes.
Thanks. Well, Kevin Featherstone, you had a rather different kind of less positive view, I think, on this.
I think can't judge whether a glass is half full or not. I don't think we can judge that over 200 years, but I'll have a drink with Stathis sometime and he can persuade me. I think the key points that has been made is as Yanis said, about the leverage from the bond markets. And I accept that that's a key constraint, but the limitation of that constraint is that it does nothing for the stimulus or the spread of domestic reform. And Stathis has just referred to an alignment with the West, which has been positive. Okay, but I think, as I would see it, it's part of that kind of self-torture of the difference between elite aspiration and domestic reality in terms of conditions of what can be delivered. And on the point about individual identity and agency, I think a key point here is of a long-term historical embeddedness in terms of attitudes towards state institutions and the lack of trust in them. A sense of the state being open to capture. We are the masters now. We can distribute Roussetti, clientelistic politics, etc., rather than seeing the institutions as agents of changing course and of reform. So I think, yes, okay, geopolitical issues, Greece was on the right side, nice. And the bond markets gave leverage, nice. But in terms of the domestic development of Greece, I don't think those did that much for stimulating and setting the terms of domestic reform, not in the 19th century and not today. That's the limits of the EU today, I think, as well.
Thanks. So just let's stick with this then. I mean, clearly 40 years of EU membership has not been a panacea for the problems of Greek development and institutional failings, and a failure to address the problem of clientelism and to introduce a modern impersonal public administration. On that measure, I would say that the EU membership has actually been a failure. And indeed, it's maybe possible to be a bit of an agent provocateur here in the discussion. You could say that far from leading to convergence, we've seen increasing divergence, and particularly then with another anniversary, 20-year anniversary of Greece's membership of the Eurozone, we've seen Greece and other southern states falling behind and actually being overtaken now by various East European countries in terms of development, at least measured by GDP per head. So
could I
glass half full or half empty?
Could I just respond to that? I think it's more that the European community has deepened the test of membership. So in an increasingly heterogeneous economy with, as you say, Joan, a single European currency across very diverse systems, Greece has found the test increasing and much more severe. At the same time, the European Union has not given itself the instruments to deal and manage with that heterogeneity. We have the bailout constraints, but not the domestic investments and the domestic mechanisms for changing public administration, for wider institutional reform. Let's talk universities, let's talk public administration, etc., etc. Those have been left beyond the reach of reform, and the EU has got nothing to do in those respects.
Thanks. So was there a possibility at any point of another way, way for Greece to have actually reduced this level of dependency? Why was it that with the return of democracy after 1974, why did neither of the dominant parties, the systemic party, ever seriously try to tackle this problem of clientelism? Was it the domestic political constraint? What was it? Or was it something more structural, historical, that has prevented that? Yanis,
because politically, clientelism is a system that has paid off for parties, both older and newer parties with a more radical agenda. But in general, I think whenever I think about these kinds of issues, I think the question is, what is the counterfactual we're using? When we say that Greece has not converged enough, what is the counterfactual we have in mind? Because the counterfactual I have in mind is Asia, Near East or North Africa, which is not really, a very nice counterfactual. So, of course, Greece has not fulfilled the full potential of European membership, but the alternative to me was either membership in the Soviet bloc after the end of the Second World War, the beginning of the Cold War, or some sort of non-aligned status in the Near East, the sort of Lebanon of the North. And frankly speaking, this is not a very enticing counterfactual to my mind. So we have to keep this in mind, I think.
I mean, you say that clientelism paid off, and obviously it did pay off for a while, and that seems to have come to the end of the road, and we're now in a situation. Yes, but we're now in a situation where those political parties have, really lost the capacity to mobilize domestic support. I mean, look at what has happened to PASOK. We have New Democracy back in power as a kind of lesser evil.
Remarkably stable, and you can think of Syriza as the new version of PASOK. So overall, if you look at politics today in Greece compared to where politics were before the crisis, we're back to where we were at the beginning of the crisis. There hasn't been any fundamental change. You have two parties, in a sense, competing for alternation in power with quite deep domestic support. I don't see elements of alienation at a very systemic level. Certainly, when we compare levels of interest in politics, turnout in elections with other European countries, we don't see tremendous and huge differences. There is a sort of disenchantment across not just European political systems, but democratic political systems in general. So I don't see Greece diverging after that. And I think it's worth pointing to the resilience of the political system. If there is a political lesson to be derived about the crisis, that the country experienced an economic shock that exceeded in proportion everything that a developed economy has experienced, and certainly was more acute than the Great Recession of the United States. And yet, the system managed to equilibrate itself. The political and the party system are fairly stable right now. Democratic institutions did not collapse. And most of the sort of apocalyptic or even negative predictions about the rise of neo-Nazis, the rise of populism, have not materialized. Syriza is moving towards the center. The neo-Nazi party has disappeared. All the parties, the populist parties that emerged in the wake of the crisis, are no longer around. So I would say it's remarkable how the country has absorbed this incredible shock, at least from the perspective of the political system.
Any other views on this?
Yeah, except the point about the counterfactual. Clearly, Stathis is right that fortune did appear. I think it's more a question of the system of which Greece is a part. And Greece is perhaps exceptional, but part of a wider group. If we look at the indicators in terms of levels of trust in institutions, perceptions of corruption, perceptions of institutional effectiveness, etc., then Greece is part of a group which is mostly in Southeast Europe, but also includes Italy, And so I think it's more a question of, in this case, what the system, the European Union, can offer, can manage, can support, rather than how things might have been with a counterfactual to previous historical position.
Thanks. Professor Koutsonis, would you like to come in?
Yes, thank you. I think it's there's always a time to have conversations about reform and about institutions, about corruption, and these are not that important, but it's not the only conversation. So if we were to let ourselves go back a bit to the mid-1970s, when the European Economic Community, led by France, proposed that the way to stabilize a country like Greece politically is to raise it economically and to integrate it into one or another kind of Europe. And the goal of the parties also could have been, in some cases, more spending on a welfare state, for others, more economic liberalization, as the case may be. But the shared goal always was to raise the standard of living. And if we're to look at metrics for the development of Greece since the mid-1970s, I think in this connection, the one to focus on is the rise in the standard of living, meaning per capita GDP, PPP. And this is what we should be looking at. Now, by that metric, Greece has developed in a way that is remarkable. I mean, no comparison with the way most Greeks lived in the 1960s and early 1970s. And this is something which is subjective and important to someone living in Greece. So we can talk about problems, which are many, but we also look at our parents and our grandparents, and even in my case, my own lifespan. And I find the changes remarkable. It's been tremendous with its own efforts and with the efforts of the EU as well. That's the one that I tend to look at. And by that standard, Greece up there in the top 30 usually of countries in terms of standard of living, measured as per capita GDP, PPP especially.
And I would add to that, to Yannis's point, if we look at other indicators such as Human Development Index that measure things like life expectancy. We see that there is actually sort of an additional effect that goes beyond GDP.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. We're coming to the end of our session, actually. We'll be having a 10-minute break, so it's just a time for final comments. So I would agree with that. I mean, there's this incredible pace of development and growth in Greece in the 70s and the 80s. You know, even longer into the 90s. But it would seem that there's been something of a regression since Greece joined the Eurozone. So was that a mistake? And I guess the question still seems to have gone off the agenda. Is Greece's future in the Eurozone? So shall we start first with Kevin and then Stathis, and then I'll take final comments from Professor Koutsonis as well. So Kevin first.
Not a mistake. Not a mistake. Recall that in the first years of this century, Greece was identified as with the Celtic tiger of Ireland. The growth rate in Greece was second only to that of Ireland for some sustained period, more than a decade, if I remember correctly. I think the mistake is not joining, is not a question of membership. The mistake is in terms of the design of the Euro system. That I don't think at the beginning they really expected so many EU countries to join the single currency. And they didn't provide the architecture in terms of governance and in terms of resources and funds, central budgets, etc. No fiscal union, which then made the system very vulnerable. And Greece tested its limits. As I say, Greece still shows the shortfall of the Euro system. Is Greece better in than out? Yes.
Okay, so fatal flaw was in the Euro itself rather than in Greece. Stathis?
Yes, absolutely. I will agree with that. And I think the flaws aside, Greece has committed a number of errors in the way it has managed its Eurozone membership, which was always aspirational. It was always part of a vision of closer integration. The ability to have a stable currency, the ability to have access to capital at not extortionate levels of financing. These are extremely important benefits of Greece's Eurozone membership. They were not used appropriately, partly because of European flows, partly because of Greek errors. They generated bubbles. But we have now had a number of corrections at the European level, and we now have the experience of mistakes at the Greek level. And so the hope is that this experience is going to be used for the next phase and hopefully take advantage in a more optimal way of the many benefits that Eurozone membership is providing.
Thank you. Yanis.
Yeah, I agree broadly with beginning with what Kevin was saying, which was that the problem was in the structure of the Eurozone and its architecture. And there was remember, the euro was introduced in the middle of what was purported to be an extended boom and under principles of strict monetarism. I mean, the most orthodox of all monetarist institutions. Whereas the Fed, for example, can account for questions like unemployment, the Eurozone can't. So the Eurozone was never equipped to deal with a crisis. And we're still trying to figure out what the euro should look like. And I think the general consensus is that it has to be more flexible in terms of interest rates and deficit spending, which I think is the general turn in economic thought nowadays anyway. But joining the euro, a better euro, I think was and is a good idea. It's a beautiful tool of integration. It was just very badly thought out in the beginning.
Okay, well, thanks to all three of you. It's been a very interesting discussion, and I'm sorry we can't carry on for longer. We're going to turn now to have a 10-minute break, and then we'll be looking at the question of whether Greece's debt at 209% of GDP is sustainable. But thanks, all three of you. It's been great having you with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.